Sit down, old man, before you break something else. Preston's voice cut through the clink of wine glasses and landed flat against the dining room walls. Nobody moved. Somewhere in the kitchen a faucet kept running, forgotten. The only sound left in a room of 11 people who had all suddenly remembered how to hold their breath. My son stood at the head of his mother's table, with her good linen napkin still tucked into his collar, looking at me the way you'd look at a chair leg that had finally given out. Something you step over, not around welcome to silent vows, where the quietest people in the room are usually the ones holding everything together. If this story finds you tonight, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because before we're done, you're going to want to say her name out loud too. My name is Walter Ashford. I'm 64 years old. For 40 years, I made my living opening things other people couldn't. Safes, vaults, antique locks nobody else would touch. And 6 months ago, I buried the only person who ever knew every combination I carried in my head, including the one to me. Tonight was supposed to be dinner. It became something else the second my son decided my wife's empty chair was an embarrassment he was finally ready to remove. I didn't sit down. The chair in question sat at the foot of the table, across from me, exactly where it had sat every Sunday, every holiday, every birthday, for as long as either of my children could remember. A plate, a folded napkin, no place card, because nobody had ever needed one. Everybody already knew not to touch it. Eleanor set that chair before I ever asked her why, and by the time I finally did ask, 20 years into our marriage, she'd only smiled and said, "Some things are still on their way, Walter. You don't rush a door that hasn't opened yet." I let it go. That was our arrangement, unspoken and 40 years deep. She held certain rooms of herself closed, and I never once tried to pick the lock. 6 months of dinners without her, and the chair had stayed exactly where it was. Nobody in the family had the nerve to move it. Until tonight. "I mean it," Preston said, softer now, performing gentleness for the table the way he performed everything, like a man reading off a card he'd practiced in the car. "It's been 6 months, Dad. Mom's gone. Setting a plate for a ghost isn't sentimental anymore. He glanced at his wife, Danielle, who kept her eyes on her wine glass. "It's starting to look like something's wrong with you." The room held its silence, a beat longer than silence usually lasts. My daughter Claire's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. My grandson, 7 years old, small enough that his chin barely cleared the table, looked up from his mashed potatoes with the frank, unguarded curiosity only a child still has permission to show. "Grandpa," he said into the quiet, "who is the chair for?" I didn't answer him. I couldn't yet. I looked at Preston instead. At the particular smugness of a man who has decided cruelty is the same thing as decisiveness, and I said the only thing I had ready. "Your mother built half of what this family has out of patience, Preston. I'm not throwing away the one habit of hers I still understand." "That's the problem," Preston said. "You don't understand it. Nobody does. That's not devotion, Dad. That's a man losing his grip on a table and calling it love." He said it lightly, almost kindly, the cruelest way a thing can be said, like he was doing me a favor by finally saying out loud what everyone else was too polite to. Then he reached down, gripped the back of that chair with one hand, and started to drag it away from the table. The legs caught on the old hardwood floor. Eleanor had refinished herself the year before she got sick, and the sound it made, a short, ugly scrape, wood dragging against wood, was the loudest thing in the house. Danielle flinched. Claire set her fork down, and I understood, in that single second, exactly how my son had come to see me. Not as his father, but as a rusted lock somebody had simply stopped bothering to fix. Easier to pry off the door than to learn how it worked. I didn't know it yet, but that was the night the chair finally opened. Just not the way any of us expected. 3 questions were sitting at that table with us, though none of us had said them out loud. Was my son actually worried about my mind, or was there something else he wanted, gone from that house along with the chair? Was the story I'd told myself for 41 years, that Eleanor was simply a sentimental woman with a private habit, even close to true, and was tonight, the 6-month anniversary of losing her, really an accident of timing? Or had Eleanor built this whole evening years before any of us knew it was coming? I reached out and put my hand flat on the back of that chair before Preston could drag it another inch. My hand was shaking. I want to be honest about that, because a man telling you he wasn't afraid in his own dining room is a man lying to you before the stories even started. I hadn't touched that chair in 6 months. I'd walked around it, dusted near it, set the table around it every single Sunday out of a habit. I couldn't have explained to a stranger, but I hadn't put my hand on the wood itself since the last time Eleanor had touched it herself. My fingers found the same worn groove on the top rail that her fingers had smoothed down over 4 decades, and something in my chest folded in on itself like a hinge losing its pin. "Let go, Dad," Preston said, quieter now, aware the whole table was watching him wrestle a piece of furniture away from his own father. "No," I said, "it wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. 40 years of standing across a workbench from men trying to intimidate me into rushing a job. I knew I couldn't rush had taught me that the quietest word in a room is the one nobody can argue with." Claire finally spoke. "Preston, just leave it. It's one chair." "It's not one chair, Claire. It's a pattern," he snapped, and something in the way he said pattern made my stomach drop before I understood why. It was the word a man uses when he's rehearsed an argument, not felt one. Dad's been slipping for months. You know it. I know it. Mom knew it before she died, which is exactly why he stopped himself, too late. "Exactly why what?" I said. He didn't answer right away. And in the silence that followed, I noticed something I'd trained myself over 4 decades to notice in other men and had somehow never once looked for in my own son. His right hand had gone to his jacket pocket and stayed there, fingers pressed flat against something inside it. The unconscious gesture of a man checking that a piece of paper he needs is still where he left it. I let go of the chair, not because he'd won, because I finally understood I wasn't fighting about a chair at all. We didn't finish dinner. Danielle made some quiet excuse about the kids needing to get to bed, and within 20 minutes the house that had been full of my family's voices was empty again except for the sound of my own footsteps on the floor. Eleanor had sanded by hand. I stood in the dining room a long time after the last car pulled out of the driveway, looking at that chair the way you look at a lock. You've already decided you're going to open, whether or not you're ready for what's on the other side of it. I need to go back, though, because you won't understand what happened next without understanding what kind of quiet Eleanor and I had built our marriage out of. I met her in 1983 in a hardware store 3 towns over from the one we'd grow old in back when I was 23 and still working under a locksmith named Grady Hollis, who taught me that a lock isn't a puzzle, it's a conversation. You don't force it. You listen to it until it tells you what it wants. Eleanor came in needing a new deadbolt for an apartment she wouldn't tell me the address of, paid in cash, and left without giving me her name. It took me 4 months of her coming back for small repairs. A sticking window latch, a jewelry box hinge, a bicycle lock she'd lost the key to twice, before she finally told me it was Eleanor, and another 2 years before she told me she'd take dinner with me on a Friday. I didn't push. That was the thing about Eleanor Ashford, maiden name Whitfield. She came toward you exactly as fast as she wanted to, and if you tried to hurry her, she simply closed the door. You thought you'd gotten halfway through and made you start over from the porch. We married in 1985. I built my locksmith business slow and honest over the following decades. Residential work at first, then commercial security. Then, by the time I was in my 40s, a reputation good enough that banks 2 states over would call me when their own in-house men couldn't crack an antique vault mechanisms. Nobody made replacement parts for anymore. I never got rich the way people mean when they say it on television, but I got steady and I got respected, and Eleanor and I built a life on a foundation neither of us ever had to raise our voice to defend. We had Claire in 1988 and Preston in 1991. Eleanor was a wonderful mother, patient in a way I only fully appreciated once I watched her be patient with our grandchildren, too. The kind of patience that isn't passive. That's a decision made fresh every single day. And from the very first Sunday dinner I can remember, after Claire was born, there was a third plate at the table that had nothing to do with either of our children. I asked her about it exactly once, early on, the way I told you. She smiled and told me some things were still on their way. I let it become part of the architecture of our marriage. The way you let a house settle into its own particular creaks. 41 years, every holiday, every birthday, every ordinary Tuesday she decided, for reasons she never explained, needed the full table set. I thought, if I thought about it at all, that it was grief for a stillbirth she'd never told me about, or a superstition passed down from a mother she rarely spoke of, or simply one of the private rooms every long marriage learns to leave shut. I never once imagined it was a door standing open for someone who might actually walk through it. Eleanor was diagnosed the spring before last. She fought it the way she fought everything, without theater, without asking anyone in the family to perform grief alongside her before she was ready to let them. She died in October in the house, in the bed we'd shared for 39 years, with my hand in hers and the porch light on, because she'd always hated the dark driveway. I will not walk you through the last months in detail. Some rooms of a story a man keeps shut the same way Eleanor kept hers, and I think, having lived beside her locked doors for 40 years, I've finally earned the right to a few of my own. What I will tell you is this. 3 weeks before she died, on an afternoon when the hospice nurse had stepped out and Preston hadn't come by in 4 days, Eleanor gripped my hand with more strength than I thought she had left in her and said, "Walter, when I'm gone, don't let Preston near the workshop safe until you've opened the puzzle box yourself. Promise me. The puzzle box, not the filing cabinet, not the will, the box you made me." I promised her without understanding a single word of it, because that is what you do at a bedside like that. You promise first and try to understand later. She fell asleep almost immediately after, and by the time I thought to ask her what she meant, the moment had passed into the kind of blur the last weeks of a life like that become, and she never brought it up again. I told myself, in the months since, that grief had confused her, that the box she meant was nothing more than the wedding gift I'd built her with my own hands in 1985. A small mahogany puzzle box with a false bottom, the kind of thing every locksmith eventually makes for the person he loves. More sentiment than security. I told myself there was nothing inside it but old photographs. I was wrong on both counts, and I didn't know it yet. But the chair Preston had tried to drag away from my dinner table that night was about to teach me exactly how wrong. After everyone left, I didn't go up to bed. I went down to the workshop instead, the converted garage where I'd spent 4 decades of evenings and every Saturday morning of my adult life, surrounded by pin tumblers and wafer locks and the particular oiled metal smell that had meant home to me longer than the house itself had. The puzzle box sat on the shelf above my bench, exactly where it had sat since our wedding day, dust-free, because Eleanor had never once let me put it anywhere she couldn't reach to wipe it clean herself. Mahogany, the size of a shoebox, its lid carved with a pattern of interlocking rings. I'd spent 3 months getting right the winter before I asked her to marry me. I had built the mechanism myself. 14 separate moves, in a specific order, before the false bottom would release. I hadn't opened it in years. I told myself, standing there with my hand on the lid, that I already knew what was inside. A stack of old photographs, her mother's rosary, the movie ticket stub from our first date that she'd once shown me with an embarrassed laugh, and then never mentioned again. I was halfway through the sequence, my fingers finding the moves, my hands still remembered even though my mind had half forgotten the order, when I heard the workshop door creak open behind me. It was Claire. "Dad," she said, and something in her voice made me turn around fast enough that my elbow caught the edge of the bench. She was standing in the doorway in her coat, car keys still in her hand, like she'd driven back the second she left. Her face had the particular pale, careful look of someone who has just decided to say something she's been swallowing for a long time. "I need to tell you something about Preston before you go any further with whatever you're doing, and I need you to not ask me how long I've known." I set the box down on the bench, both moves I still needed to make left undone, and looked at my daughter standing in a doorway her mother had walked through 10,000 times, and understood, the way you understand a lock has been tampered with before you even see the marks on it, that the story I thought I already knew about my family had never been the whole story at all. The workshop was cold enough that I could see my own breath by the door, but Claire came in anyway and shut it behind her. The way you close a door when what's about to be said inside shouldn't travel any farther than these four walls. How long? I said. 3 months. Maybe 4. She set her keys down on my bench, next to a jar of old brass pins I hadn't sorted since summer, and pulled her coat tighter around herself like the cold in the room had only just reached her. I found something at Danielle's back in August. She'd left her laptop open on the kitchen counter while she went to get the kids from the pool, and I wasn't snooping. Dad, I swear to you. I was just looking for a recipe she'd texted me, and there was an email open from a lawyer about you, about me, about a durable power of attorney, Preston's lawyer, drafted in July. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, soft at the creases, the way paper gets when it's been unfolded and refolded too many times by someone working up the nerve to show it to somebody. I took a picture of it that day. I've had it printed out in my glove compartment for 3 months, trying to figure out how to tell you without it, sounding like I was accusing your own son of something I couldn't prove. I unfolded it under the workbench light. It was a standard financial power of attorney form, the kind I'd signed a version of myself for my own father 20 years earlier, granting one party full authority over another's assets, accounts, and property in the event of incapacity. At the bottom of the page was a signature. My signature, my full name, my particular slanted W, the little hook at the end of the D, that I'd been signing the same way since I was 19 years old, and Grady Hollis made me practice it on 100 blank invoices until it looked, in his words, like a man who meant it. I had never signed this document in my life. It's dated 3 weeks before Mom died, Claire said quietly. He never filed it. I checked with the county clerk's office under a fake reason, said I was doing a title search for the house. Nothing's recorded yet, but it's ready, Dad. It's sitting in a drawer somewhere, ready to go the second anyone decides you need it. And tonight, at dinner, her voice caught, and I watched my daughter, 36 years old and steady her whole life, have to stop and start the sentence again. Tonight wasn't about a chair. He's been building a case for months that you're slipping. The chair was just the easiest thing in the house to point at in front of witnesses. I set the forged page down on the bench next to the puzzle box. 2 objects side by side that had absolutely nothing to do with each other and everything to do with the same man. My hands had gone from shaking with grief to something steadier and colder, the particular stillness that used to come over me at a bank vault at 2 in the morning with an alarm system I had exactly one chance to get right. Why, I said. Not how. Why? Your brother has a good job, a house, 2 kids in private school. What does he need my signature for that badly? Claire hesitated long enough that I understood she'd already guessed the answer and hated it. I don't know the whole shape of it, she said, but Danielle let something slip in August. Before she caught herself, she said Preston's been handling an investment situation for almost a year, late payments to somebody she called the Hargrove people. I looked it up. There's no Hargrove Capital registered in this state, Dad. There's no Hargrove anything I could find. Whatever it isn't the kind of thing you find in a phone book, and it isn't the kind of thing a man borrows from casually. I want to tell you I felt fury in that moment. The clean, simple kind you can point in a direction and let loose. I didn't. What I felt was closer to the particular sick drop in the stomach a man gets when he opens a lock he was told was empty and hears, instead of nothing, the small metallic click of a mechanism he didn't build and doesn't understand. My son wasn't just cruel at that dinner table. My son was drowning and had decided, somewhere in the last several months, that the fastest way back to the surface was over the top of me. There's something else, Claire said, and reached for my sleeve the way she used to when she was small enough to need my hand crossing a street. Mom knew. I think Mom knew before she died. I found a receipt in her nightstand after the funeral, a courier service, 3 separate charges over her last 2 months, all going to the same address in Hartford. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I thought maybe she was mailing gifts, but I've been sitting with it for 6 months, Dad, and I don't think Mom was mailing anybody a gift. I looked at the puzzle box, 14 moves. I'd made 10 of them before Claire walked in. I finished the last 4 with my daughter standing beside me, both of us silent. the workshop lit by a single bulb hanging over the bench the way it had hung there for 40 years of ordinary Tuesday night repairs. About to illuminate something neither one of us had ever guessed at. The false bottom, released with the same small, satisfying sigh of wood. On wood it had made the first time I'd tested the mechanism in 1985, 3 weeks before our wedding, in this same workshop, with Eleanor standing exactly where Claire was standing now, laughing at how long it had taken me to get the fourth ring to catch. Inside, beneath a folded piece of blue velvet, I remembered lining the box with myself. There was a stack of envelopes tied with kitchen twine, yellowed at the edges, a small gold locket, oval, the clasp worn smooth, and a single sheet of hospital letterhead, folded in thirds, dated June 14th, 1966. 19 years before Eleanor and I ever met, Claire made a sound beside me that wasn't quite a word. I opened the locket first, because my hands went there before my mind gave them permission. Inside, on one side, a photograph of Eleanor at 17, thinner faced than I ever knew her, standing in front of a house I didn't recognize. On the other side, an infant, days old, wrapped in a hospital blanket, eyes shut against the light. I unfolded the hospital letterhead next. It was a birth record. Mother, Eleanor Rose Whitfield, age 17. Father, name left blank. Child, female, 7 pounds 2 ounces, born 4:12 a.m. Beneath it, in handwriting I would have known anywhere, in ink that had gone brown with 4 decades of age, a single line had been added later. Clearly not part of the original hospital form. They named her Grace before they took her from me. I never got to. I sat down on the workshop stool because my legs had stopped its being entirely willing to hold me up. Claire crouched beside me and put both hands over mine, over the letter, the two of us reading it a second and third time as though repetition might change what it said. Dad, she said very quietly. The chair, I nodded. I couldn't speak yet. 41 years, Claire said, and her voice broke fully this time, no longer trying to hold itself together for my sake. She set a place at every single dinner of our childhood for a sister we never knew we had. I opened the first letter in the stack, the twine coming apart in my fingers with the particular ease of something that had been tied and untied many times over many years. It wasn't addressed to me, it was addressed to Grace, not sent, never sent, 41 years of unsent letters, one written on every anniversary of a birth. Eleanor had spent her entire adult life, quietly, privately, unbearably mourning, in a house full of people who loved her, and never once knew there was a room in her they hadn't been allowed into. I read 3 of them out loud to Claire, because I didn't trust myself to read them silently, without losing whatever composure I had left. And a man reading his dead wife's grief out loud to his daughter in a cold workshop at midnight is, I have since learned, one of the few kinds of crying a person can do that doesn't feel like breaking. It feels like something else. It feels like finally being handed the last page of a book you'd been reading for 40 years, thinking the whole time that you already knew how it ended. Claire put her arms around me somewhere in the middle of the second letter, the two of us holding on to each other the way our family had somehow never quite learned how to do easily, not because we didn't love each other, but because Eleanor had built our household on quiet dignity instead of open feeling. And I understood, sitting there with my daughter's arms around my shoulders and my dead wife's handwriting in my hands, that quiet dignity had a cost neither of us had ever fully reckoned with until this exact night. The last letter in the stack was different from the others. It wasn't addressed to Grace at all. It was addressed to me. Walter, it began, if you're reading this, it means you kept your promise, and it means I'm gone, and it means I finally have to tell you the truth about a debt I've been carrying since before I ever knew your name. I found her 3 years ago. Not by accident, I hired someone, quietly, the way you'd hire someone to find a lost key rather than break down a door. Her name is Grace Bennett now. She's a forensic accountant in Hartford. Walter, of all the professions in the world. And when I read that in the report the investigator sent me, I sat in this kitchen and laughed until I cried, because I always did believe some things run in the blood, whether you raise a child yourself or not. I wrote to her. She wrote back. We met 4 times over these last 3 years, in a diner outside Hartford, where nobody from our life would ever think to look for me. And I want you to know, Walter, that not telling you was the only real secret I ever kept from you in 39 years of marriage. And I kept it not because I didn't trust you, but because I was a coward about my own shame for longer than I had any right to be. I was going to tell you this spring. I had the words ready. Then I got sick, and the words got harder to say than the disease did to fight. And somewhere in those last months I made a different choice instead. I asked Grace for one more thing before I told you anything at all. I asked her, because of what she does for a living, to quietly look into something that had started troubling me about Preston, something in the way he'd started asking. About the business, about our accounts, about what happens to everything Walter and I built when I'm no longer around to ask. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, Walter. So I asked someone whose job is not believing things until the numbers prove them true. I don't know what she found. She was still working when I lost the strength to keep asking. But I know my son, and I know myself, and I know that whatever it is, you deserve to face it with both of your daughters standing beside you, whether or not either of you has ever met. Set the chair, Walter. Keep setting it, the way I taught you to without ever asking why. 6 months after I'm gone, if I've timed this right, and I have never once in our marriage failed to time something right, Grace will knock on that door. Let her in. I love you. I have loved you since a Tuesday afternoon in a hardware store when you spent 20 minutes explaining a deadbolt to a stranger who didn't need it explained at all because I already knew everything about how it worked. I just wanted to hear you talk. Nell, I don't know how long I sat there after I finished reading. Long enough that the workshop bulb overhead had started to feel less like light and more like a held breath. Claire had gone quiet beside me. Her own tears dried to the salt-tight feeling on the skin that comes after real crying, and when I finally looked up from the letter, she was staring at the workshop door the way you stare at something you've just heard move. "Dad," she whispered, "someone's on the porch." I heard it too then, not a knock yet, just the particular weight-shift creak of the third porch step, the one Eleanor had asked me to fix for 15 years and I never had. Because some sounds in a house are worth more unfixed than fixed. I stood up, my knees stiff, the letter still in my hand, and Claire's hand found my other one, and held it the way she used to hold it crossing streets. And together we walked out of the workshop and across the dark yard toward the house. The knock came just as we reached the porch steps. 3 knocks, evenly spaced. Polite but not tentative. The knock of someone who has rehearsed this exact moment in her head more times than she'd ever admit to a stranger. I opened the door. She was standing under the porch light in a gray coat, a leather bag over one shoulder, an envelope in her hand that she was holding the way you hold something you're afraid of dropping. She had Eleanor's chin. I saw it before I saw anything else about her. The same set to the jaw, the same steady, patient way of standing still while she waited to see what you'd do with the sight of her. "Mr. Ashford," she said. Her voice shook slightly on my name, the only sign she gave that this was costing her something too. "My name is Grace Bennett." I think she stopped, started again. "I think your wife left instructions for tonight. I'm sorry it's so late. I didn't want to come at all until I was completely sure. But I finished the audit 2 days ago, and I don't think it can wait any longer than it already has." Behind me, I heard Claire draw in a breath. "The audit of what?" I said, though some part of me already knew. The same part of me that had spent 40 years listening to Locks tell me what they wanted before I ever had to force them. Grace held up the envelope in her hand, and for the first time since she'd started speaking, her voice went flat and careful and entirely professional, the voice, I would come to learn, that she used whenever the thing she had to say was too large to say any other way. "Of your son's business, Mr. Ashford, and of what he's been doing with the power of attorney he's been trying to get you to sign since March." I stepped back from the door and, for the second time that night, let someone I hadn't been ready for cross the threshold of the house Eleanor had built. Grace stepped into the front hall of a house she had never once been inside, and stopped, and looked at everything the way a person looks at a room they've built in their head for years and are finally allowed to walk through. The photographs on the stairwell wall, the coat hooks by the door, still holding one of Eleanor's cardigans that none of us had been able to move yet. The particular smell of a house that had been lived in, honestly, for 40 years, wood polish and old books, and underneath it, faint now but still there, whatever Eleanor's perfume had been. She never told me what the house looked like, Grace said, mostly to herself. In 4 meetings, she never once described it. I think she wanted to be the one to show me, eventually. I think she ran out of time before she got the chance. Claire was standing at the bottom of the stairs, one hand still gripping the banister, looking at this stranger with her mother's chin the way you'd look at a photograph developing in real time in front of you. "I'm Claire," she finally said. "I'm—" She laughed, a short, wet, disbelieving sound. "I don't even know what the word is. Half-sister feels too small for tonight." "Sister's fine," Grace said quietly, "if you'll have me." I didn't know it yet, but that would be the last time in this whole story that a door in our family opened easily. I brought Grace into the kitchen, because a kitchen table is a smaller, kinder place to hold a conversation like the one we were about to have than a dining room with an empty chair still sitting in it. I made coffee I don't remember tasting. Grace set her bag on the table, unzipped it, and pulled out a folder. Not thick, I noticed. Not the kind of stack of paper a man drowns a room in when he's trying to overwhelm rather than explain. Eleanor had chosen her daughter's profession without ever meeting her, and somehow the daughter had still grown into a woman who understood, the same way her mother had, that some truths land harder in a few pages than in 100. "Your wife came to me 3 years ago," Grace said, both hands flat on the folder, not yet opening it. "She hired an investigator to find me the year before that. I want you to know, before anything else tonight, that finding me wasn't about replacing the family she already had. She told me that herself, the first time we met, before I'd even said a word back to her. She said, 'I'm not here to take anything from anyone. I only ever wanted to know you existed in the world, and to make sure, if I could, that you knew the same about me.'" I nodded. I couldn't yet manage more than that. We met 4 times over 3 years, diners, mostly. She liked one outside Hartford with bad coffee and good pie, and she'd laugh about it every time, said the coffee was so terrible it made the pie taste like a reward. Grace's mouth curved, briefly, at the memory, before the rest of what she had to say pulled it back down. "The last time I saw her was in July, 6 weeks before she died. She was already very sick by then. She didn't tell me how sick until that visit, and that day, she asked me for something different than she'd ever asked before. She asked me, as a professional favor, to look into her son's business." "Why you?" Claire said. "Why not hire someone local, someone who didn't have to carry all of this at the same time?" "Because she trusted family before she trusted strangers," Grace said simply. "Even a daughter she'd only known 3 years. She told me that too. She said, blood finds its way to the truth faster than a stranger ever will, even blood that's had to find its own way home first." I finally reached across the table and opened the folder myself, because I understood, watching Grace's hands go still over it, that some part of her needed permission before she could hand her mother's last request over to the family it was going to hurt. The first page was some simple. A summary, 3 paragraphs, written the way I imagine Grace wrote everything, plainly, without decoration, the facts arranged so there was nowhere for a reader to hide from them. Preston's consulting business, the one he'd told the family for 6 years was managing a modest but growing book of private clients, had in fact been effectively insolvent for the better part of 18 months. He had been covering the gap, not with new legitimate clients, but with a series of increasingly large personal loans from a private lender operating under the name Hargrove Holdings. A lender Grace's investigation had found, with no state registration, no public office, and a documented history of extending short-term high-interest financing to men and women who had already exhausted every legitimate source of credit available to them. The kind of lender who doesn't send collectors with clipboards. The kind who sends men who show up at your office unannounced and stand a little too close while they talk about deadlines. "How much?" I asked. Grace didn't flinch from the number. $210,000 as of last month, with a repayment structure that compounds fast enough that by spring, without new capital, he won't be able to service it at all. Claire made a small, sharp sound, more air than word. "He tried 3 things to find that capital. Grace continued. First, he quietly moved a portion of two long-standing clients' retirement accounts into a self-managed fund he controls directly, small enough amounts, spread across enough transactions that neither client has noticed yet, but large enough on paper that if it's discovered, it isn't a business failure anymore. It's a felony. She let that sit a moment before going on. Second, 3 months ago, he opened a home equity line against a property he doesn't legally own outright. This house, Mr. Ashford. He used a copy of your signature from an old joint refinancing document you and Eleanor signed together in 2015, and a notary he'd used before who either didn't look closely enough or didn't want to. The application is sitting, unapproved, at a regional bank because the underwriter flagged an inconsistency and asked for an in-person visit. He's been stalling them for 6 weeks. I thought of the folded page Claire had shown me in the workshop, my own signature staring back at me from a document I'd never signed, and understood now that it hadn't been one attempt. It had been the second and the third, I said. Grace's eyes met mine, steady, careful, the way Eleanor's had been steady and careful in every photograph I'd ever seen of her giving someone hard news gently. The power of attorney. If he can get you declared even mildly incapacitated, or get your signature on that document by any means at all, he gains legal authority to sell this house outright, liquidate whatever accounts remain, and use the proceeds to satisfy Hargrove before the interest compounds any further. He isn't doing this because he stopped loving you, Mr. Ashford. From everything I found, and everything your wife told me before she died, I believe your son is doing this because he is more afraid of the men he owes money to than he has ever let himself be afraid of losing this family. He's not the architect of tonight. He's the one being run. I sat with that a long moment. There is a particular kind of anger that burns hot and fast, and there is another kind, colder and slower, that settles into your chest like something taking up permanent residence. And I felt the second kind arrive in me that night at my own kitchen table, 40 years too late to help my son, and exactly in time, I hoped, to still help my grandchildren. He's drowning, I said finally, and instead of telling me, he decided to pull the house down with him. People rarely ask for help the way you'd want them to, Grace said. They ask for it sideways, badly, sometimes in ways that look like cruelty instead of fear. I've spent 15 years reading financial records for a living, Mr. Ashford. I promise you, cruelty and fear leave almost identical fingerprints on paper. The only difference is what a man does once he's caught. Claire reached across the table and took my hand again, the second time that night, and this time Grace's hand came to rest over both of ours without either of us asking her to. 3 people who had been strangers to each other, 12 hours earlier, holding onto one table the way you hold on to the one solid thing left, standing after a storm has taken the roof off everything around it. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment because it is the part of this story I understand least even now, months later, telling it to you. I felt Eleanor's hand in it. Not sentimentally, actually physically. The ghost of 41 years of her setting a place at a table for someone she loved and couldn't yet reach, finally closing the last inch of a distance she had spent her whole adult life trying to close an inch at a time. I understood, sitting in my kitchen with my daughter and a woman I'd known for 11 minutes who shared half my dead wife's blood, that Eleanor hadn't set that chair for 4 decades out of grief alone. She'd set it out of faith, faith that someday, if she was patient enough, if she loved carefully enough and quietly enough and long enough, the chair would finally be filled, and everyone she loved would be sitting around the same table at once. She had simply never imagined it would happen 6 months after she was gone, and that the same night would also be the night we learned her youngest son had spent a year trying to steal the roof out from over all of our heads. I need to admit something to you here, because a man telling you the truth about the people he loves owes you the truth about himself, too. I have spent most of my life believing that patience was the same thing as strength, that if I simply waited long enough, worked steadily enough, said little enough, the people I loved would come to understand me without my ever having to ask them to. I raised my son on that same philosophy, mostly by accident, mostly by simply being who I already was, and assuming he'd absorb the parts of it worth keeping. I never once sat Preston down and told him it was safe to come to me with a debt, a failure, a fear he couldn't carry alone. I modeled quiet endurance so thoroughly that my own son learned, somewhere along the way, that asking for help was the one door in our family he was never allowed to knock on. I don't say that to excuse what he did. I say it because I think I own a piece of how he got here, and pretending otherwise would make me no better than the son I was about to have to face. We stayed at that table past 2 in the morning, the three of us, working through what Grace's folder contained and what it would take to keep it from destroying everything at once. There was a plan by the time the coffee had gone cold a second time. It wasn't a plan built on rage. It was built the way I'd built every difficult lock I'd ever opened in 40 years of doing this work. Slowly, in the right order, with every move made only once we were certain of the one before it. We would hold the dinner Eleanor had, in her own quiet way, already scheduled for us. The 6-month remembrance on what would have been our 42nd wedding anniversary, the date she had told Grace to come to the house if she hadn't already by then. The whole family would be there, and at that table, with witnesses who loved this family enough to hold it together rather than watch it burn, we would give Preston the one thing none of us had ever offered him before: a door out, built by the people who loved him, instead of a trap sprung by the people he owed. But we would also quietly, before that dinner, make sure the house itself could never be signed away out from under any of us again. 3 days later, I drove to the county recorder's office myself and filed an emergency revocation of every power of attorney on record with my name attached to it, valid or forged, and had a new one drawn up naming Claire as sole agent, witnessed and notarized by a lawyer I'd trusted for 20 years, a man who'd once helped me register the patent on a lock mechanism I'd designed, and had never once, in all that time, given me a reason to doubt him. I called the regional bank underwriter who'd flagged Preston's home equity application and, without accusing my own son of anything over the phone, asked enough careful questions that the application was quietly frozen, pending further documentation neither Preston nor his notary would ever be able to produce. And I called Vincent Ferris, an old friend from my banking security days, a man who now consulted for exactly the kind of regulatory bodies that took a professional interest in unlicensed lenders operating under names like Hargrove Holdings. I told him what Grace had found. I asked him if it was within his power and his ethics both to see what the state's Financial Crimes Division already knew about a lender by that name, and whether the men behind it were as far outside the law as their business practices suggested. He called me back 2 days later. Hargrove Holdings, it turned out, wasn't just a predatory operation preying on desperate men like my son. It was already under quiet federal investigation, had been for over a year, for a pattern of loans extended specifically to people it could later pressure into laundering funds or forging documents on its behalf, men it didn't just lend to, but used, the way a hand uses a glove and discards it once the job is done. My son wasn't simply a debtor. He had become, without fully understanding it himself, a tool in someone else's much larger crime, and the moment that investigation closed in, whatever protection his silence had bought him would disappear along with it. Preston wasn't the man holding the knife in this story. He was the second man Eleanor's chair had been waiting to save, and none of us had known it until it was almost too late to save him at all. The morning of the dinner, I stood in the workshop one last time, before the family began to arrive, the puzzle box open on the bench in front of me, Eleanor's unsent letters resting exactly where I'd found them 6 days earlier. I picked up the locket and closed my hand around it, the cool weight of it settling into my palm the way it must have settled into hers, 41 years ago, in a hospital room I would never see, and a grief I had never once been allowed to help her carry. I kept my promise, Nell, I said out loud, to an empty workshop that had never once, in 40 years, felt entirely empty when I talked to her in it. The box is open. The chair's about to be filled. Now I just have to see if I'm strong enough to do the rest of it the way you would have. I put the locket in my breast pocket, next to the folded copy of the forged power of attorney Claire had first shown me, and walked back up to the house to help set the table for the dinner that was finally, after 41 years, going to seat every single person Eleanor Ashford had ever loved at once. The dinner was set for 6 o'clock, and by 5:30 the house was fuller than it had been since the funeral. Claire arrived early with her husband and their son, the same boy who had asked 3 weeks earlier who the chair was for. My sister-in-law came. Two of Eleanor's oldest friends from the church choir came, women who had known her since before I did, and who, without my asking, had simply shown up on the porch at 5:15 with a casserole and a look on their faces that told me they knew exactly what kind of night this was going to be, even if they didn't know the details. I hadn't invited them. Claire hadn't either. Eleanor, it turned out, had left a short list of names with her closest friend months earlier, along with a single instruction. If Walter ever needs people in that house who love him without needing anything back, make sure they're there. Grace arrived at 5:45, in the same gray coat, carrying nothing this time but herself, and stood a moment on the porch before she came in, looking at the door the way you look at a threshold you've imagined crossing so many times that the real thing feels almost unreal. I met her there and walked her in myself, my hand steady on her shoulder, and introduced her to the room simply, the way Eleanor would have wanted it done. No drama, no announcement, just the truth, spoken plainly. "This is Grace," I said. "Eleanor's daughter, her first daughter." I paused, and felt the whole room go still around that word the way it had gone still, around Preston's cruelty 2 weeks earlier, except this stillness had a different shape to it entirely, not shock closing a door, but shock holding one open. "She's family. She has been for longer than any of us knew." Preston and Danielle arrived last, at 6:03, and I watched my son's face when he walked through his mother's front door and saw an extra place already set at the head of the table where the empty chair used to sit. Not empty anymore, a full setting, a woman he'd never met sitting quietly beside his sister, with an expression that gave nothing away except patience, the same patience his mother had spent 41 years perfecting. "What is this?" he said. Not loudly. Carefully. The way a man speaks when he already suspects he's walked into a room that knows more about him than he's comfortable with. "Sit down, Preston," I said. "It's your mother's table. She's the one who planned tonight." He sat, eventually, though it took him longer than it should have, his eyes moving from Grace to Claire to me and back again, doing the same arithmetic I'd done 6 nights earlier in the workshop, and arriving, I could see, at an answer he didn't like. "We ate. I want you to know that we actually ate first, because some things deserve to happen in the right order, even when the whole house is holding its breath. And Eleanor had taught me, across 41 years of dinners exactly like this one, that a family sits down together before it does anything else, no matter what else the night is going to hold." "My grandson," said Grace, unprompted, the way he'd been taught at his mother's church, and at the end of it added, without anyone asking him to, "And thank you for whoever's supposed to sit in Grandma's chair now, because I don't think it should be empty anymore." Nobody laughed. Several people cried instead, quietly. The particular kind of crying that comes from a child saying out loud the thing every adult at the table has been too afraid to say themselves. It was Danielle, of all people, who broke the silence that followed. She had been quiet through most of the meal, her eyes moving between her husband and the empty space at the table that wasn't empty anymore, and when she finally spoke, her voice had a steadiness in it I had never once heard from her in 8 years of family dinners. "Preston," she said, Tell them what you told me last week when you thought I was asleep." He looked at her the way a drowning man looks at the one person who's just cut the rope he was using to pull someone else under with him. "Danielle," he said. "Not now." "Yes, now," she said, and her voice rose, not into anger exactly, but into something firmer than I had ever heard from her before, the sound of a woman finally choosing her children over her husband's silence. "I've watched you disappear into that phone for a year. I've watched you flinch every time it rings. I sat next to you in bed last Tuesday while you cried into a pillow because you thought I couldn't hear you. And I am done, Preston, I am done sitting quietly at a table, pretending I don't know something is eating you alive. Your father deserves the truth. Your mother clearly already knew it before she died. You are the only person left in this house still pretending." The room had gone entirely silent now, The kind of silence Preston had once tried to weaponize against me over an empty chair. Except this time the silence belonged to him. I reached into my breast pocket and set two things on the table in front of him, side by side, the way I'd once set two mismatched keys in front of a customer to let the shape of them tell the story instead of me. The first was the folded copy of the forged power of attorney. The second was a single printed page from Grace's folder. Not the whole file, not a dossier meant to bury him, just enough. A summary. His debt to Hargrove Holdings, the amount, the timeline, the federal investigation already circling it whether he confessed tonight or not. I'm not here to destroy you, I said. I want to be very clear about that before you say another word. I'm here because your mother spent 3 years quietly building a bridge to a daughter she thought she'd lost, and the last thing she did with the time she had left was try to build one to you too, in the only way she knew how, by making sure the people who loved you would be sitting at this table the night you finally had to stop carrying this alone. Preston stared at the papers on the table for a long moment, and I watched something in him that had been braced for 2 weeks. Braced against me, against the family, against the whole shape of the trap he'd been building, finally give way. He put both hands flat on the table, the way I had put my hand flat on the back of that chair the night he'd tried to drag it away, and when he spoke, his voice had none of the cruelty it had carried at the last dinner in this room. I didn't know how to tell you, he said. Any of you. I told myself if I could just fix it before anyone found out, it would be like it never happened. Every month I told myself that. And every month it got worse instead of better, and I got more afraid. And being afraid made me, he stopped, swallowed, and looked at me directly for the first time since he'd sat down. It made me cruel, to you of all people. The one man who never once, in 38 years, made me feel small for needing help with anything. I did that to myself, Dad, and then I tried to do it to you instead of admitting it. Who are these people? I said. The ones you owe. I need you to say it out loud, Preston. Because I already know, and I need to hear that you're finally ready to stop protecting men who were never protecting you. He told us, all of it. The first loan, 18 months ago, meant to cover a bad quarter. He was too proud to admit to anyone. The second loan to cover the first. The visits that had started polite and turned, over the last 2 months, into something closer to threats delivered in expensive suits by men who never raised their voices because they never had to. The forged signature, the stalled bank application, the power of attorney he'd drafted in July and never quite found the nerve to force on me, though God knows he'd tried, right up until the night he'd reached for that chair instead, and found, without understanding why, that it was easier to attack an empty piece of furniture than to look his own father in the eye and ask for help. Somewhere in the middle of it, my phone rang. I almost didn't answer it. I remember thinking, absurdly, that whatever it was could wait until my son had finished telling the truth for the first time in over a year. But it was Vincent, and Vincent didn't call during dinner hours unless it mattered. So I stepped just far enough from the table to hear him, and stayed close enough that everyone could hear my half of it. Walter, he said, the federal task force moved tonight. 2 arrests in Hartford an hour ago. 3 more expected by morning. Hargrove Holdings is finished, the whole operation, the loans, the men behind it. Your son's debt dies with it. There's no one left standing to collect on it. And no legitimate court in this country is going to enforce a predatory loan structure that's about to be the centerpiece of a federal fraud indictment. He paused. Tell him he's clear, Walter. Whatever else happens in that house tonight, tell your boy that debt is gone. I walked back to the table and set the phone down, screen still lit, and told them all what Vincent had told me. I watched Preston's shoulders drop the way a man's shoulders drop when a weight he's carried so long he'd forgotten what walking upright felt like is finally, suddenly, physically lifted from him. He put his face in his hands and wept openly at his mother's table, in front of his wife and his children, and a sister he'd met an hour earlier, and a father he'd tried to strip of his own house 2 weeks before. And nobody in that room moved to comfort him right away, because some grief has to be let all the way out before anyone can safely step into it with you. It was Grace who finally reached across the table and put her hand over his. I never got the chance to know our mother the way you did. she said quietly. 3 years of dinners at a diner outside Hartford, and I'm still angry some days about all the years before that I didn't get. But I know this much about her. From the little time we had, she never once asked me to hate anyone for what they'd done. She asked me to help her build a way back for the people she loved, even the ones who'd lost their own way back on their own. I think that's what tonight was always supposed to be for. Not a trial. A door. Danielle finally put her arms around her husband, and Claire reached across and took Grace's other hand, and I stood at the head of my wife's table and watched my family. All of it, finally, every single person Eleanor Ashford had ever loved, gathered in one room for the first time in 41 years. Begin, slowly and imperfectly, the way any real healing actually happens, to hold each other up. I want to tell you something I've come to understand since that night, something I didn't have the words for at the time. There is a kind of justice that happens fast and loud and public, the kind you see in courtrooms and headlines, and there's another kind that happens quietly, at a kitchen table, when the people who love each other finally stop protecting their own silence and start protecting each other instead. Both kinds matter, but only one of them actually mends anything. Hargrove Holdings is gone, and I won't pretend I don't take some satisfaction in knowing that the men who preyed on my son's fear are facing consequences they spent years believing they were too careful to ever face. But the thing that actually saved my family wasn't a federal indictment. It was an empty chair, 41 years of patience, and a woman who understood, long before any of the rest of us did, that the only way to fix a broken silence is to finally fill it. We sat at that table another 2 hours after Preston finished telling the truth. Grace told us about growing up in Hartford, adopted by a kind couple who'd raised her with love but never quite managed to answer the one question she'd carried her whole life: where she came from and why. Claire told stories about our family. Eleanor had never gotten to tell her firstborn daughter herself birthdays and Christmases, and the particular way her mother used to hum while she cooked, off-key and completely unbothered by it. My grandson fell asleep in his chair somewhere around 9, the way children do at the exact moment a room finally feels safe enough to stop staying awake for. Preston stayed until everyone else had gone. He helped me clear the table, the two of us working in a silence that had none of the coldness of the silence 2 weeks earlier, and when the last plate was dried and put away, he stood in the kitchen doorway the way Claire had stood in the workshop doorway 6 nights before, working up the nerve to say one more thing. "I'm going to need help fixing this," he said. "Not just the debt, all of it. Danielle, the kids, you. I don't know how to be the kind of man who asks for help, Dad. I never learned it. Neither did I said. 40 years I ran a business on the idea that a man solves his own problems quietly and doesn't bother anybody with the weight of it. Your mother spent 41 years trying to teach me otherwise, one empty chair at a time, and it took me until she was 6 months in the ground to finally understand what she was showing me. I made my own mistakes raising you, Preston. I let you believe silence was strength because it was the only language I knew how to speak fluently myself. We're going to have to learn a different one together, starting now, if you're willing." He nodded. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, my son hugged me, not the brief, dutiful embrace of holidays, but the kind that actually holds on, the kind that admits, without either of us saying it out loud, how much we'd both been carrying alone that we never needed to. It's been 4 months since that dinner. Preston sold the consulting business, the shell of what was left of it, and works now under another advisor he trusts. Learning the parts of the trade, nobody teaches you in a rush to look successful too young. He and Danielle see a counselor together on Thursdays. He calls me on Sundays now, not because Eleanor's ritual demands it, but because he wants to. And there's a difference between those two things that took our family a long time and a great deal of pain to finally learn. Grace comes to dinner most weeks. She sits in the chair her mother sat for 41 years, and some evenings I catch her running her thumb along the same worn groove in the wood that Eleanor used to smooth down without noticing she was doing it, and I wonder if some things really do live on in the blood, the way Eleanor always believed they did, whether or not you're raised in the same house. I kept the puzzle box. It sits back on its shelf in the workshop now, empty of its old contents. Because I moved the letters in the locket into a frame Claire helped me build, hanging in the front hall, where every person who walks into this house will see them and understand, without my having to explain it, exactly how much patience it took to build the family standing beneath that frame. Last Sunday at dinner, my grandson looked around the table, full now, every chair filled, no empty place left anywhere in the room, and asked me the same question he'd asked 6 months earlier, except this time he already knew part of the answer. "Grandpa," he said, "is Grace's chair still the one Grandma always kept for her?" "It is," I told him. "It always was. Your grandmother just needed the rest of us to grow patient enough to finally understand it." He thought about that for a moment, the particular serious thinking of a 7-year-old working through something larger than himself, and then he said, "The thing I think Eleanor would have wanted said at that table more than anything else, more than any lesson about money or forgiveness or the men we'd all had to become that year. I think that's a nice thing to do," he said. "Keeping a chair for somebody even before you know when they're coming." I looked down the length of my wife's table, at every person she had spent a lifetime quietly making room for, and told him he was right. It is a nice thing to do. It might, in the end, be the only thing worth doing at all. Keeping a place open and trusting, patiently, faithfully, for as long as it takes, that the people you love will eventually find their way home to fill it.